So what are the secrets that pro level jazz musicians know that allows them to play incredible jazz solos? Well, today I'm gonna go over 4 tips so that you can start playing like them too. Let's do this. Now, a very common frustration for musicians trying to play jazz is their solos. They're never really happy with their solos or satisfied, constantly trying to find whatever that special secret sauce is for amazing jazz solos. Well, I'm gonna go over these 4 tips that I know are going to really help you if you start taking action. Tip number 1 is to focus less on scales and focus more on chord tones. Now, when it comes to jazz and listening to your favorite jazz solos, the likelihood of them focusing on scales is very low. In fact, they're definitely very versed in playing the chord changes and spelling out those chords in their musical lines. For example, if we have a 1-6-2-5-1 in B flat, it's B flat major, G7 secondary dominant, C minor 7, and F7. Well, one scale you could play over top of all that is the B flat major scale. Now, obviously there's only one note with that G7 it clashes, but you could also treat each one individually, like a B flat major, a G7 mixolydian, and then a C Dorian, and then an F mixolydian. But all of that is really almost completely just B flat major, and you wouldn't really hear the difference between the chords if you're coming at it from a scalar approach. Therefore, it's better to think about chord changes. So what I would really recommend you do is become an expert at spelling out the chords. So for example, if we started mapping out the chord tones on this 1-6-2-5, it would sound like this. And if we're connecting the chord changes in such a way that we're using what we call voice leading, which is simply connecting the chords to the nearest chord tones together, that's when we can start figuring out how to connect those sounds together in a more dynamic and musical way later on. But if we're not familiar with how to map out those chord tones, then we're really a few steps behind where we need to be. So make sure that you know how to spell out the chord tones of every single chord that's existing in jazz, all the qualities of 7th chords, but also figure out ways that you can connect them kind of like I did just there. Become an expert at this, and I guarantee you your solos are immediately going to take a next step up. Now, tip number 2 is to focus on strategies for resolving to those chord tones. One thing that jazz musicians do really well is they use what are called approach tones, meaning that they are approaching what we call target notes in their lines from chromatic and diatonic whole steps and half steps. To give you an example of what that actually looks like, we can take a look at this exact same chord progression, the 1-6-2-5, and identify what are the notes that we want to target. Now, the notes that we want to target are the thirds and the 7ths. Those are what would be called the guide tones, but really you can pick any chord tone that you want. So in this case, in this approach tone line that I have composed, the B natural on the G7 is going to be our first target note. Now the B natural is the major third, so we are targeting the major third. The next target tone that we are targeting is on the C minor, and we're targeting the E flat, which is again the third. It's the flat third. And finally, the last target tone is the A natural on the F7. So the A natural on the F7 is the third. So I often like to think about the note that comes before the target tone, or even the 2 to 3 notes that come preceding the target tone. So in this particular case, I'm gonna go ahead and just slowly play through this approach tone line. So again, it's B flat major 7, G7, C minor 7, F7. And so we're gonna play. Okay, so that was our first target tone, the B natural on the G7. So I'm basically walking up the chord tones of that B flat major, right? And then I am approaching it. We call that an enclosure, where you're approaching from below in pitch and then above, and then down to that B natural for the G7, the third. So these are all diatonic approach tones that we're using here. Then I'm choosing to play this flat 9 that sounds really good. Okay, and then arriving at that E flat, so in a stepwise motion, right? So those approach tones are the G, the F, leading into the E flat, the third of the C minor. So we have, okay, now from the E flat, we have to get to the A natural of the F7. So we're gonna go up the arpeggio, up the chord tones of C minor, and then we're gonna do a chromatic passing tone. This chromatic passing tone is not in C minor, but we're enclosing it with this A flat note, and then arriving at the A natural, right? The third of the F7 right there. So in totality, it sounds like this. And jazz musicians, pro jazz musicians, are really good at figuring out how to resolve to those chord tones. So use exercises like this for yourself to start getting better at doing this. And by the way, if you need any help working on some of these techniques, definitely check out our LJS Inner Circle membership. We work on approach tone maps, guide tones, chord tones, and etudes all the time inside there. So check it out, ljsinnercircle.com, and we'd love to have you come over there and become a member. Now, tip number 3 is to learn licks and even entire solos of jazz musicians by ear. I want to emphasize the by ear point because great jazz improvisers, they have amazing ears and they've internalized jazz language on a very deep level. And so if you're just learning solos and licks by reading music, you're really operating out of a different part of your brain than you want to be as a jazz improviser. For example, as a classical musician, it's a great idea to be learning how to play music by rote, but it's a really good idea to be learning it by ear if you want to become a great jazz improviser. So for example, you could learn how to play this particular lick. This was a lick from one of our etudes that we studied in our Inner Circle membership. It's over a 1-6-2-5, and it sounds like this. Really great line. It spells out all the chord changes, has some chromatic passing tones in it as well. All of that combined to create a beautiful musical line using some of the tenets that we recently discussed. So learning that by ear, even if it's just note by note from a recording, is really going to pay dividends for you and your ear and your improvisation. Tip number 4 is to compose your own jazz solos and licks. Now, this is something that the pros are really doing. After they've learned how to play other people's music to get some inspiration and ideas, they're going out and not only improvising for themselves, but dreaming up the actual music they would want to play. Slowing the improvisation process down to composing allows you the ability to really figure out what you would want to play and internalize something that comes from you. So for example, I composed this lick over the same chord progression, and it sounds like this. And that was really just the first idea that came to my head and really to my ear. It was just something that came easy to me. And those are the things that I really want to identify and latch onto because those are most likely to come out in my actual playing. And I can use the lessons that I've learned from chord tone maps, from approach tones, from other people's musical language and adopt it for myself. And by the way, if you want to learn more about approach tones, how they work, some more in-depth techniques for playing bebop language, click on the video on the screen right now where I talk about how to play instant bebop. That's a great one to check out next. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure you like this video if you found it useful, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.